live on YouTube. And okay, in 5 seconds, you can begin.
Can I? I don't see David.
Yes, yes.
Is that okay? That I don't see.
You should see David Shaddock. Like maybe open the Zoom.
I don't see him. I don't.
I'm not sure why is that happening. Maybe make it okay.
Yeah.
Now
Is
you
it-
will see Shaddock when he begins.
Okay. Okay. Hi, David. How are you?
Hello, Cristina. We meet. So nice. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, it's our pleasure having you here. Can we start then? Yes. Okay. So thank you all for being here, still being here after a long day. But even though we are facing the last plenary conference today, the closing plenary conference today, we are doing so with a smile, with a very, very big smile. I am very, very happy to introduce you to David Shaddock, Dr. David Shaddock. He is a poet and psychotherapist. His most recent books of poetry are Vernal Pool and the Book of Splendor, New and Selected Poems on Spiritual Themes. His most recent nonfiction book is Poetry and Psychoanalysis, The Opening of the Field. This was published in Routledge 3 years ago in 2020. His column, Poetry and Healing, appears in the online journal Poetry Flash. He studied with Denise Levertov at Berkeley in 1969, what a year, which led to their ongoing friendship. In the 80s, they shared the parallel experience of Denise's conversion to Catholicism, and the deepening of his Jewish faith. David maintains a private psychotherapy practice at Berkeley and lectures widely on couples therapies. Tonight, he's going to close this magnificent long day of dialogue and deepening in the craft of poetry by these two huge American poets. He's going to close with a plenary talk entitled Imagine Ruskin in the Wilderness, Thoughts on Denise Levertov's Development Within and Beyond Williams Mentorship. David, whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can everybody see me? Am I don't. Okay. This is this is a very strange experience. Although I've done it a number of times now, it's still odd but wonderful to be able to be here where I am in Berkeley, California, and talking to you in Madrid and beyond about a subject that's incredibly near and dear to my heart. I thought I'd mention real quickly before I start my presentation exactly that many of you may know that this past Tuesday, 2 days ago, was Denise Levertov's 100th birthday. And in honor of that, a few of us who were very close friends of Denise got together for a Zoom call, and a lot of reminiscences and a lot of thinking about just what a force she was, and a consensus that maybe we were glad for her sake that she didn't live to see the times we've all been through, but for our sake, how much we would need a voice like Denise's to steady us and keep us in the right frame of mind to deal with the present realities, many of which she was aware of environmental degradation, war, and injustice, and formed a major theme. So I changed the title slightly, one to correct a misquote from the poem on my part, and another to just make it a little clearer. So I'm going to reread the title and then get going here. The title of the poem, of the paper as it is Imagine Ruskin in the New World, Levertov's Journey into and Beyond Williams' Influence. So here we go. And can everybody hear me? Is this all right? I mean, all the technology is working? Okay.
Yes, everything is working perfectly. We can
Thank
see
you, thank you.
As Big Brother.
It's an honor to be here and talking to all of you. So here I go. I am speaking tonight not only as a poet, critic, and lover of Levertov and Williams' work, but also as a longtime friend of Denise Levertov. I studied with Denise at Berkeley in 1969, and we became close friends afterward. I shared with her some of the spiritual and religious developments I will discuss in this talk. And I had the very sad experience of being at her bedside in Seattle when she died in 1997. What I hope to do here is trace the arc of Levertov's career into, and then to some extent away from Williams' influence. I did not know Williams, but I did study at Berkeley with James Breslin, whose book, William Carlos Williams, An American Artist, is a very fine appraisal of Williams' work. And when Denise would describe all the artwork in Williams' house, or talk poignantly about how he seemed after his stroke, I felt a deeper connection with him. I'd like to start this talk with a quote from the piece, The Destruction of Tenochtitlan, from Williams' prose work In the American Grain. I'm gonna, since I'm speaking in English and many of you are Spanish speakers, I'm going to try and read all the quotes twice and carefully and clearly, so maybe that'll make it easier to follow. The quote is, and this is actually the first sentence of this piece, upon the Orchidean beauty of the new world, the old rushed inevitably to avenge itself after the Italians' return. I'll read that again. Orchidean, like an orchid. Upon the Orchidean beauty of the new world, the old rushed inevitably to avenge itself after the Italians' return. Of course, the Italian is Columbus. In addition to being one of the loveliest sentences I've ever read, what jumps out here is the dialectic of old world versus new. The new world is seen as innocent and beautiful, the old as fueled by vengeance and envy. There is also a hint of sexual violence. It may be difficult over the span of 100 years, during which America has lost much of its Orchidean innocence, to imagine this dichotomy. But Williams' defense of the American sensibility against the established order of Europe was central to his poetic project. Behind this project is Whitman, and behind Whitman, Emerson and the Transcendentalists. Let's look at this quote from Emerson from his Divinity School address. Whilst the doors of the temple stand open night and day before every man, and the oracles of this truth cease never, it is guarded by one stern condition. This, namely, it is an intuition. Whilst the doors of the temple stand open night and day before every man, and the oracles of this truth cease never, It is guarded by one stern condition, this namely, it is an intuition. This is democratic with a small d. Every man has the right to enter, and it establishes the individual's personal intuition as the supreme authority. Let's compare it with this prose passage from Spring and All. This is the passage from Spring and All that precedes section 6, I believe. The inevitable flux of the seeing eye toward measuring itself by the world it inhabits can only result in himself crushing humiliation unless the individual raised to approximate co-extension with the universe. This is possible by aid of the imagination. Complex. The prose, and I mean, I don't know if you've had sessions on the prose and Spring and All, but it's an absolutely fascinating study in and of itself. The inevitable flux of the seeing eye toward measuring itself by the world it inhabits can only result in himself crushing humiliation unless the individual raised to approximate coextension with the universe. Approximate coextension with the universe. This is possible by aid of the imagination. The imagination makes you as wide as the universe. This is pure Whitman, really. My imagination makes me as wide as the universe. What in 19th century Emerson is the key to the temple becomes in 20th century Williams a way to avoid crushing humiliation by the weight of the world. But my thesis here is that what Williams means by imagination is very close to what Emerson means by intuition, and that they both have at their core the idea of a liberating and particularly American self-invention. So that seems to me a kind of summary of Williams' project, a liberating and self-preserving self-invention. Let's move forward some 30 years to Levertov's arrival on the American scene. Williams, who had endured the defections of both Eliot and his old friend Pound to Europe and the general obscurity of his work, is surprised and delighted to be adopted by his elder years, is surprised and delighted to be adopted in his elder years by a new and devoted group of American rebels. He enjoyed visits and appreciation from Ginsberg, Creeley, and especially Denise Levertov. I think he must have been very moved by the humble appreciation this gap-toothed English woman showed him. Levertov's family background and the dreary landscape of post-war London left her ripe for self-invention, or at least reinvention. Homeschooled by her Welsh mother, she'd been free to pursue whatever she was interested in, ballet, literature, and ignore the rest, including arithmetic. She never learned how to calculate a simple percentage for a restaurant tip. She'd bring out a little card if she was paying. Her father, from a line of Hasidic rabbis, pursued his vision that Christ was the Messiah and became an Anglican priest in England. So there was ample family precedent for her meeting Mitch Goodman on a holiday and moving to America. Denise was a sensual, joyous person. To illustrate a point or show appreciation for an iris sticking through a fence, she would skip into a ballet step or twirl. Of course, she would find delight in the way energy flowed through Williams' poems. She admired the freedom of his invented forms and adopted Creeley's form is never more than an extension of content. But she also admired Williams' precision, his ear for speech, and his great eye for detail. In her essay, Williams and the Duende, from the Poet in the World, she cites these lines from Approach to a City. This is Williams' poem, Approach to a City. I never tire of the mystery of these streets. The 3 baskets of dried fruit in the high barroom window, the gulls wheeling above the factory, the dirty snow, the humility of the snow that silvers everything and is trampled and lined with use. One more time. I never tire of the mystery of these streets. The 3 baskets of dried fruit in the high barroom window, the gulls wheeling above the factory, the dirty snow, the humility of the snow that silvers everything and is trampled and lined with use. Certainly she admires the precision of the perception, of the seeing, and of the details that Williams picked up. And I think she also greatly admired his choice of quotidian details to fill up his poems. This is the opposite of lofty poetry. The line breaks here, dirty and snow, that silvers is trampled, track precisely the poets, and by extension, the readers turn from joy to heartbreak and back again. Here's a bit of Denise from the mid-50s that crackles with Williams-esque invention and energy. This is from her poem, Merritt Parkway. And it's spread all over the page, which you can't see, but is something she obviously got from Williams. The cars that keep moving ahead of us, past us, pressing behind us, and over left, those that come toward us, shining too brightly, moving relentlessly. Try that again. The cars that keep moving ahead of us, past us, pressing behind us, and over left, those that come toward us, shining too brightly, moving relentlessly. You can just see the energy of those cars on the freeway, which of course must have been somewhat amazing to Denise in New York. The whole page here becomes a canvas for Levertov to imitate, not to copy nature. I don't know if that line from Williams' poem, later poem, The Desert Music, to imitate, not to copy nature. That was one of Williams' most, central poetic aesthetic choices, to imitate, not to copy. In other words, 2 by 2. The poem and nature form a kind of dual reality, but the poem is not slavishly devoted to nature. Not only did Denise embrace Williams' poetics, she codified them in her 1965 essay, Some Notes on Organic Form. Following on Emerson, she states that organic poetry was founded on an intuition of an order, a form beyond forms, an intuition of an order, a form beyond forms. I think she here has internalized the most important lesson she learned from Williams. His verse, though as she called it, exploratory, was not free, but adhered strictly to its own intuition of a deeper form. And I think that's a really important idea. What she saw in Williams was not just a liberation from formal metric poetry. She found in him a search for a deeper, more true form, not formlessness, not self-expression, but something he searched for in all of his life, the true form that was revealed through imagination, through intuition. Though Williams was not an overtly spiritual poet, Denise detected an underlying spiritual message in his search for these deeper forms. In that sense, one could say that her later turn to religious poetry was foreshadowed by naming such poetics organic, indicating a natural or universal form that the poem ascribes to. Some steps away from WCW. In her 1991 essay, Some Affinities of Content, Levertov recalls her gradual move away from Williams and the Black Mountain School aesthetics. I, as a young poet, was often drawn to the structure or technique of poems I read, and paid less attention to what was being said. Whereas the older I grow, the more I find myself more concerned with content. Such content might or might not be found in a discovered or in hearing form. This essay is decidedly not a breakup letter with Williams, whose love for the tenacious life force, for qualities of daring, imagination, persistence, perceived in weeds and birds or in some rickety building. So that's Denise writing in 1991, still, and as she always did, lauding Williams and seeing her as a central poet. Something she didn't keep all of the poets that she was close to in the 60s, but she certainly kept Williams. But the essay does acknowledge her turn away from the more experimental aspects of Williams' work, aspects that the postmodern and language poets who emerged in the 70s especially cherished in Williams. Some of these poets, Ray Armantrout, Ron Silliman, were in Denise's workshop with me at Berkeley. These poets claimed Williams as a founding influence, not so much Levertov. Levertov had entered the scene at a contentious time in American poetry, as epitomized by two competing anthologies, Donald Hall's Contemporary American Poetry and Donald Allen's The New American Poetry. Denise's inclusion in the latter cemented her place in the beat New York School Black Mountain avant-garde. But I never got the impression that any of that much mattered to her. Indeed, aside from Robert Duncan and Robert Creeley, the poets I met through Denise, Elizabeth Bishop, Maxine Kumin, Carolyn Kaiser, were not part of any particular school or movement. I'm thinking now that the first lines of her poem To R.D., March 4th, 1998, written many years after her and Duncan's famous poetic breakup, could have applied to Williams as well. Here's those first lines of her poem to Duncan, but I'm suggesting maybe she could have almost written them to Williams too. You were my mentor. Without knowing it, I outgrew the need for a mentor. As early as 1960, Levertov, in a letter to Williams, delineates some of their difference. I grew up not an American and not in an English, but a European atmosphere. And she, in the letter, she underlines both English and European. After description of her complicated family background, she continues, I feel the great European poets belong to me as an inheritance too. So that's, Williams seems obsessed with creating a purely American art. And 1960, Denise is saying, how could that be true for me? I'm a European at heart. The poetry in my soul is the great poetry of Europe. But there is more at stake than geography in this delineation of difference with Williams. Levertov was grappling with her sense of the limitations of Williams' self-invention. Here's the Williams critic James Breslin on this limitation. In America, transcendentalism, by affirming the metamorphic powers of the human mind, had liberated the creative energies of the generation that included Whitman. The gesture animating Emerson's nature is one that transforms the cosmos into an ocean, as it was at the very beginning of creation, so that we, godlike, can start building a world all over again. And this is the key sentence from Breslin. But the trouble with heeding Emerson's injunction to build, therefore, your own world, very famous Emerson quote, build, therefore, your own world, as Whitman soon found out, was that you become its sole inhabitant. So I think there she's exploring the limitations of, well, Breslin is, but I think what at the same time, of a kind of American individualism. Perhaps Denise, who describes herself in the letter to Williams I've been quoting as at home everywhere and nowhere. She says, I'm at home everywhere and nowhere, was sensing the potential loneliness that Williams would describe in Danse Russe. I am lonely, lonely. I was born to be lonely. I am best so. So I think that's I think many men feel that anywhere, everywhere, but I think that's a particularly American cry. I'm lonely, lonely. I was born to be lonely. I am best so. Even though Williams ironically titled that poem Danse Russe, it's really a dance American, isn't it? As she turns aside from the concerns of style and form, Levertov is drawn to two particular types of content: poems that describe a spiritual quest and poems that describe nature, particularly wilderness. It pleased me greatly that Denise cited two of my poems in her essay as examples of the former. It is important to note, for the purposes of this discussion, that both these affinities are for poems that point to something pre-existing, something outside of themselves, and by extension, something outside the solipsistic trap that Breslin fears self-invention will lead to. Does this turn toward content and away from the preoccupation with form map to the old world, new world dialectic we discussed earlier? Denise asks this very question, wondering if she was returning now to the thematic tendencies that most interested me when I was younger, before I had come to America and became for a while more interested in form than content. Is there a European Denise that her American influenced self returned to? So here's a poem that feels quite, oi, what happened there? Larry? Okay. I think it's, all right. Can everybody see me and hear me? My screen went dead. All right. Here's a poem that's called The Faithful Lover from Evening Train, 1992. A very central book for Levertov, in which she imagines an encounter in Yosemite between John Muir and John Ruskin that offers us some clues. It's a bit of a long poem, but I'm going to read it and then maybe I'll read it again in parts. It's called The Faithful Lover. The Faithful Lover. Play with a few decades, shift them. Try to imagine Ruskin in the New World, walking with John Muir in the wilderness. He who's enraptured first sight of the Alps, i.e. Ruskin, he who's enraptured first sight of the Alps transformed him that meek Protestant Sunday when he and Mama and Papa and dull cousin Mary were patiently waiting the secular week's beginning before attempting the sights, but all unawares came face to face with the sublime. Unmistakably not clouds, surpassing all that engravings had promised, floating west of Schaffhausen, sharp, tinged with rose, far into blue, suddenly beyond. Changed him from a docile prig, poor child, he was 14 and knew so much and so little, to a man of passion, whatever his failings. Imagine him in Yosemite with loyalties already divided, rock simple or rock wrought, strata of mountains, strata of human craft, tools of geology or tools of art have split him. Would wilderness, legend unknown, or if known, offering no toehold for his mind's expectant footing, have swept him wholly into its torrents of non-human grandeur? Or wouldn't art have pulled him back in the end to layered history, felt in the bones, even geology, a fraction of that insistence, loved for its poetry of form, color, textures, not as a scientist loves it, but to where human hands created, this is Ruskin, rich tessellations or of the shadowy Rialto, through its colossal curve slowly forth, that strange curve so delicate, so adamantine, strong as a mountain cavern, graceful as a bow just bent. Back to where nature, even the Alps, still so remote, unsung through so many centuries, lay in the net or nest of perception, seen, then re-seen, recognized, wrought in myth. So, I mean, I picked that poem because it just lays out so clearly the dichotomy that Levertov, this English poet, come to America, comes under the influence of Williams, was struggling with. Wilderness or art? Is that, to her, there is something very profound in that dichotomy. I'm going to read just this middle section of this. Imagine him, Ruskin, in Yosemite, with loyalties already divided, rock simple or rock wrought. There it is. The mountains themselves, or something that we make of those mountains. Strata of mountains, strata of human craft, tools of geology or tools of art have split him. Would wilderness, legend unknown, or if known, offering no toehold for his mind's expectant footing, have swept him wholly into the torrents of non-human grandeur? Or wouldn't art have pulled him back in the end to layered history felt in the bones? Even geology, a fraction of that insistence, love for its poetry of form, color, textures, not as a scientist loves it, but to where human hands created rich, this is Ruskin's prose, rich tessellations or the shadow of the Rialto through its colossal curve slowly forth, that strange curve so delicate, so adamantine, strong as a mountain cavern, graceful as a bow just bent. I think it's particularly Levertovian to be hung up on this question of art versus nature. But I think what it foretells is a search for something beyond nature, beyond this world, something universal. I'm going to offer a very brief discussion of Denise's relationship to Ruskin and to wilderness, particularly American wilderness. But let me say that for purposes of this discussion, I read the subject of this poem as not only Ruskin in the wilderness, but Levertov in America. Denise loved Ruskin and would refer to him often in her discussions of art and poetry. Am I right in recalling a slight defensiveness in her glance at me when she brought him up? How square. Ruskin. Despite her progressive politics and embrace of the American avant-garde, there was a Victorian side to her, conservative in its morals and artistic taste. Going to a museum with her, she would skip the abstractions and spend much time with medieval religious art, small portraits and landscapes, or mythological tableaus. She would be delighted at the way representation has come back into fashion, but she would be unmoved by the irony that attended its discovery. The upshot here is that art for her is a thing, a sublime, not just a process. Denise's relationship to wilderness was limited by the fact that she never learned to drive, and though vigorous, was not inclined to outdoor adventuring. She loved her country home in Temple, Maine, and later delighted in the nature that surrounded her home in Seattle near Lake Washington. Mount Rainier, the subject of many of her later poems, was often visible, but she loved its remoteness and wrote against the urge to climb on it or conquer it. In Effacement, she allegorized it, comparing it to the archangel walking with Tobias on dusty roads. Lines that it's almost unimaginable for Williams to have written, comparing a mountain to the archangel walking with Tobias on dusty roads. So here we are in the poem, shifting decades and geographies to have John Muir and John Ruskin walking in the wilderness. Muir doesn't speak in the poem, but he is there to represent the direct perception of nature, unfiltered by preconceptions or culture. Was Levertov herself thinking of this when she imagined Ruskin struggling to find a toehold for his mind's expectant footing in Yosemite? Was she struggling to find such a toehold in the New World? The Ruskin quotes at the end of the poem all point to cultural, not natural artifacts, while the rocks of Yosemite are the thing in itself, not caught in Ruskin's or Denise's net or nest of perception, net or nest of perception. Though net or nest appear to be a positive, they are in fact distinct. A net captures something wild. A nest locates it, gives it a home. What to do with Williams' Orchidean beauty of the New World, with torrents of non-human grandeur, the poem asks. We must take its measure with something human, with art, with culture, the poem implies, arguing for bringing an old world sensibility to the new. And beyond the human measure, as we shall see, the measure of the divine. The Catholic poems. When asked about spiritual poetry, Denise was fond of saying that all poetry, by virtue of its existence, was spiritual. She meant that poems came from some unknown and unknowable place. But at least after her becoming a Roman Catholic, this does not imply that she would agree with Stevens that God and the imagination are one. Her conversion was intended precisely not to fudge that bet. In unbelief in the physical resurrection of Jesus, she calls herself one of the literalists of the imagination, for whom miracle is possible and essential. We can pause for a moment on the word essential. Essential to her personally, but essential also for everything, for existence for itself, as she writes in Primary Wonder, one of her latest poems. The mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything, rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. Read that again. The mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything, rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. Denise is standing clearly here for an essentialist epistemology, placing her firmly in the sights of a constructivist postmodern critique. There are no ideas but in things, but there are no things without God. It would be a mistake, however, to claim that Levertov had turned her back on Williams here, allying herself with Eliot's I am an Anglo-Catholic in religion, a classicist in literature, and a royalist in politics. Eliot's famous statement. Levertov's conversion did not so much fly in the face of postmodern thinking as ignore it altogether. Hers was not a critique of Williams' faith in imagination, but an extension of it. It is through an act of poetic imagination that she could come to say, in effect, yes, Bill, but the wheelbarrow depends on God. So that's me making that up. The wheelbarrow depends on God. In her essay, Work That in Faiths, she describes how she embarked on a voyage of do-it-yourself theology. Sometimes, she continues, it was in poems that the process took place, and most notably in the first such poem I wrote, a longest piece called Mass for the Day of St. Thomas Didymus, Doubting Thomas. If poetry is not founded on pre-existing forms, beliefs, or truths, she seemed to be saying, it nonetheless can lead us to them. Let me conclude with this talk with a discussion of the Agnus Dei section of Denise's Mass. I remember her reading me the entire Mass poem soon after she finished it. After a long time of quiet, I exclaimed, "Oh, Denise, I think that's your masterpiece." "I think it may be," she replied. Here's the conclusion of that poem. I'm going to read it through twice. It's a little on the long side, but I think we do need to hear it twice. What terror lies concealed in strangest words, O Lamb of God, that taketh away the sins of the world, an innocent smelling of ignorance, born in bloody snowdrifts, licked by forbearing dogs more intelligent than its entire flock put together. God, then, encompassing all things, is defenseless? Omnipotence has been tossed away, reduced to a wisp of damp wool. And we, frightened, bored, wanting only to sleep till catastrophe has raged, clashed, seethed, and gone by without us, wanting then to awaken in a quietude without remembrance of agony. We who in shamefaced private hope had looked to be plucked from fire and given a bliss we deserved for having imagined it. Is it implied that we must protect this perversely weak animal whose muzzle's nudgings suppose there is milk to be found in us? Must hold to our hearts a shivering God? So be it. Come rag of pungent quiverings, dim star. Let's try if something human still can shield you. Spark of remote light. Maybe I'll make a few comments and then read a little bit of it more. I want to briefly comment on both the theology and the poetics of this passage. In terms of the former, though Levertov is adopting the form of the Latin Mass, her interpretation of the gospel passage is anything but static. It draws more from her father's Jewish mystical tradition than from traditional Catholic theology. Jewish mysticism holds that it is up to humans to change God, particularly from being a God of judgment to being a God of loving kindness. Just as Jacob wrestles all night with the angel of God, so Jewish scholars and mystics wrestle with God, not only to extract a drop of wisdom, but to win, to get God to change his harsh judgments. Here, though, Levertov has turned this notion of God wrestling completely on its head. In her hands, it becomes God nursing. It is not the Lamb's radical innocence that redeems the world, but the act of maternal love that the Lamb, at least potentially, evokes in the human heart. As the poem makes clear, longing for redemption, for being plucked from the fire, will not suffice. The terror mentioned at the beginning of the poem is existential. God will not protect us. Rather, it is up to us to protect him. In the Idra Rabbah section of the Zohar, the rabbis, out of concern for the fate of the world, convene the great assembly and try and get the lower god of fate and judgment to meet face to face with the Ancient of Days, the higher God of compassion and loving kindness. Only through this face-to-face encounter with its exchange of energies can the world be saved. Though I'm not sure Levertov knew of this particular esoteric teaching, something similar is afoot in her poem. Just as the Zoharian imagination of the rabbis is the key to salvation, Levertov's poetic imagination, let's see if something human, what a heartbreaking line, let's see if something human still can save him, is the key to unlocking the power of the Lamb's radical innocence. The spark of remote light the poem ends with recalls the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, which Denise and I did discuss, in which tikkun olam, the repair of the world, requires human intervention together with remote sparks, where the remote sparks hide inside the broken shards of the world. Let me just read the conclusion, the very last bit of it. Is it implied that we must protect this perversely weak animal whose muzzle's nudgings suppose there is something to be found in us? Must hold in our icy hearts a shivering God? So be it. Come, rag of pungent quiverings, dim star. Let's try if something human still can shield you, spark of remote light. The poetic tools that Levertov uses in this poem are Williams. The Lamb of God is not a symbol, but a pungent, smelly, and unintelligent creature, its thingness undercutting any lofty theological associations. She employs Williams' variable foot. Her lines range from a single word up to a line like, to awaken in quietude without remembrance of agony. But each line is precise and faithful to the thought and rhythm of the work as a whole. Levertov's God is not a product of her poetic imagination, but she has used her poetic imagination to approach and perhaps even influence him. The poem is both rooted in old traditions and a radical act of poetic and religious self-invention. How could Williams not have nodded in approval and delight?
Thank you very much. You finished, right?
Now we have questions, right? Oh, I guess I didn't know I was finished.
Thank you very much for your talk, David. It has been such a nourishing and intellectually challenging as well presentation. You have, for me, I'm just sharing with you how I received it. It was, you were taking us through a path and showing us those aspects that you find that coalesce with Williams, as well as those others, with the ones that you finished, that actually took Levertov through her own path. Has been such an interesting talk. I wonder whether you have questions in the audience, any questions or comments that you would like to raise. Why not coming here so that he can see you? What do you think? So that, yes, and Julie will be asking you a question. Come here and yes, I think, yes.
Be careful. Oh, yeah.
I'm delighted to see a human face. I've been only looking at, oh, Cristina.
Okay, hello. Thank you for that wonderful talk. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry. Close to, okay, but I'm doing, my face is
Yes,
going to be on the
yes,
screen.
I can.
Sorry if my face is too close. It's the microphone. Yeah, I really love the reading. I love the mass anyway, and the reading was wonderful. I was thinking reading in terms of Williams and of spring and all, and the birth of things coming into this kind of cold world. Do you think she had that in mind? Possibly she was writing the mass and sort of responding to Williams in that way too.
I hadn't thought that, but it's a wonderful idea, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That
If you want
the subtext, you know, the subtext of spring and all isn't only rebirth. It's death. You know, it's the struggle between life and death by the road to the contagious hospital. Well, the contagious hospital is in that poem, not to undercut the lyric impulse and set the lyric impulse inside a tragic world. This is kind of what Denise often complained that Williams was really profoundly being misread. You know, that no ideas and things didn't mean no ideas. So that the battle in in so much of spring and all. The and all is everything that's not spring. You know, there's a tremendous tension. And Williams saw himself as passionately committed to rebirth. So it's a very prescient question, isn't it? That's taken what I was thinking of and deepened it remarkably, that the resurrection that Denise is talking about, the redemption of the world, which in this poem so movingly is through an act of maternal love from us to God, but which Denise figures with her imagination. There's no scripture that she's referring to that sees humans nursing a little filthy, scrumpy lamb. You know, earlier in the poem, she imagined it's doing its business in her house if she takes it inside. An ironic way of looking at God. That really, thank you so much for pointing out, that really does come directly from Spring and All, from the battle between, or the struggle, I think is a better word for it, in Williams between what he calls the imagination and the forces that are crushing the imagination. The pure products of America go crazy. You know, certainly Williams was not a purely lyric poet. He was very interested in survival, and more than survival, in the moments of lyric beauty in an urban and you know, struggling landscape of struggle. So certainly that would have been a basis for kind of Christian vision, wouldn't it? I never thought that, but thank you so much for pointing that out.
No, thank you. And whether or not she had in mind, I guess I think it kind of crystallizes the distinction and the relationship you're drawing between the two of them. So thanks a lot.
I wouldn't be surprised if she had it in mind, because, you know, Denise was always thinking.
Thanks.
Are there other questions in the room? Any other questions? Esther, you're looking at me. Come here. Esther Sánchez-Pardo will be asking a question, or I don't know whether maybe making a comment.
Hello.
Another human face.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this very profound talk. It resonates with too many issues regarding Levertov's last poetry that I don't know sufficiently well. Simply since you are a student and you are a poet and you are you said before, and I happen to have read that poetry book by Levertov, that Evening Train, was a very special book of poetry, and I would like you to say a few words about that, if possible.
About the book Evening Train?
If possible, I think.
Yeah, sure.
This is.
I'd be glad to. You have to give me a second to organize my thoughts. So, in my personal sense of Denise's life, well, for one thing, if I'm not wrong, I think she wrote much of that book on Lake Como in Italy when she was a guest of the Rockefeller Foundation. which I think is significant. I mean, I think we can make too much of this, too much of what I just read my whole paper about Europe versus America. But I do think that she found an enormous peace in the 2 months or 3 months she spent in Europe. And so, and of course, the Evening Train poem, which is a marvelous poem. If you're going to pick a Levertov poem to read tonight, besides the great last religious poetry, the poem Evening Train is, you know, which is sitting on a train in England, just imagining what everybody else's life is like. And you know, Denise had a lifelong love of Chekhov, and that's a very Chekhovian poem, Evening Train, with elliptical moments of imagination into someone else's world. So, but I think there's a poise. So, you know, Denise had been, you know, the world was continually being turned upside down for her because she so cared about it. So, you know, some people took a deep breath after the end of the Vietnam War, political poetry. Okay, well, now we can go back to a pure lyric. For Denise, it was just the beginning of writing ecological poems, anti-nuclear poems, you know, poems about the destruction of the planet and the ecosystem. And she really passionately engaged with those issues, which is so, but I do think that they created, you know, along with, you know, the end of her marriage to Mitch Gooden, a lot of internal turmoil. And I think with Evening Train, you can almost feel her catch her breath and come back to the centrality of her. So why she was thinking about Ruskin and John Muir as she's sitting in a, you know, very, very nice lodgings by Lake Como sort of makes sense as we talk about it, doesn't it? You know?
Yes.
And I think that's why the poem kind of jumped out at me. You know, Denise says, I'm at home everywhere and nowhere. That was really true for her. She really did try and make a home at Seattle, but she was on the road all the time. You know, she spent a couple of weeks with us before she started teaching at Stanford. So,
Yeah.
So that book kind of represents a kind of reclaiming of a literariness. You know, I don't know, there's probably a better word for that I'm not thinking of, but, you know, a craft forward part of thinking of her poetry. And it's put together so thematically like a mosaic. So, you know, few books. I mean, you know, if you get that doorstop size book of the collected poems of Denise Levertov, you could take it on a desert island and not know that you were lost on a desert island for a number of years. But yeah, I remember Barbara Epler, publisher New Directions, published that book posthumously.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, if any of you have a job at Stanford pending, don't take it. Good Lord, Denise took a job at Stanford and died. Yvonne Boland took a job at Stanford and died. And now Louise Gluck took a job at Stanford and died. So, just a coincidence, but I'm really kidding.
Thank you.
Okay.
This was a wonderful reply, full of knowledge, and also the way you read, and also yourself as a poet and an analyst or a therapist, the way you read and the way you absorb and the way you transform as well the Levertovian text. I'm also on that line a little, you know, the literary versus, or well, I have studied as well psychoanalysis here in Madrid and a little in the United States.
Oh.
And I've been drawn. I wish we could have maybe at some point, maybe with more people, but maybe at some point I would be thrilled to have the chance to have, it could be on Levertov, but a conversation on analytical also things, because as I was listening to you speak about maternal love at this point, when you were reading her poem, I was specifically thinking of how an analyst as you, of your stature, and also a practicing poet, would understand this. Because maternal love means many things. And yeah, I'm interested, but I'm very much into that, invested as well into that. So maybe since I admire your knowledge and in total absorption of Levertov's work, maybe we could fix at some point some little conversation on analytical Levertovian subjects.
I would
very
love
much.
that. I would love that. You know, I do, in this prose book, I wrote poetry and psychoanalysis. I do take up a number of those questions you were.
I was not aware. I must blame myself because I already ordered your book. I need to have it. So maybe at some point we'll have the chance to speak, because I'm very much on the client side. But anyway, maternal law, client side.
This is not a Kleinian book, but
okay. Thank you.
Thank you. God.
Well, David, thank you very much for your astounding presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Cristina.
It was great.
I loved every second of it.
I can tell just by looking at your face and after having listened to such a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, David.
Okay.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Do I just sit here? I'm not sure if I'm supposed to do something or not.
I don't know. Can you hear? Can he hear Adrián?